Most people have no idea how much of their adult life is still being lived by the child they once were. We grow up, our bodies change, our faces age, our responsibilities multiply, but inside the mind, inside the emotional patterns that shape our days, the echoes of childhood continue replaying themselves like a quiet background melody that we unconsciously dance to. And the strangest part is that this melody often determines the limits of what we believe is possible long before we ever question it. For many people, the frustration they feel today, the repeated failures, the sabotaged opportunities, the inability to maintain consistency, the fear of being seen, the constant cycles of almost getting there and then collapsing is not random at all. It's not laziness, it's not lack of talent, it's not a lack of potential, it's a familiar loop. A loop that began when they were too young to understand what was happening. A loop silently programmed during the most impressionable years of their life. Childhood is where we learned how the world works. But more importantly, it's where we learned how we work in the world. Before we knew how to think critically, before we understood nuance, before we could challenge a belief, we absorbed everything around us as truth. The tone of a parent's voice, the expression on their face, the way they reacted when we succeeded, the way they reacted when we failed, the way they talked about money, responsibility, dreams, effort, success, and disappointment. Every one of those moments became code that wrote itself into the operating system of our subconscious. You don't remember every moment, but your nervous system does. Your emotional body does. The part of you that reacts before you can think, that part remembers everything. This is why people grow up and find themselves stuck in patterns that make no logical sense. They want to succeed, but something inside them hesitates. They want to be seen, but something inside them withdraws. They want to take risks, but something inside them insists on staying small. They want to break old cycles, but something inside them pulls them back into the same familiar emotional territory they've always known. It isn't because they're weak. It isn't because they're broken. It's because their childhood programmed them to survive, not to expand. And survival has rules, very strict rules. Rules that were formed not by your conscious mind, but by your emotional environment. If love came with conditions when you were little, you learned that safety depended on compliance. If affection came only when you performed, you learned that worthiness depended on achievement. If mistakes were punished or mocked, you learned that failure was dangerous. If emotions were dismissed, you learned to silence yourself. If your dreams were minimized, you learned to expect disappointment. If chaos was normal, you learned to feel uneasy in peace. If you were ignored, you learned to become invisible. If you were controlled, you learned to doubt your own decisions. Children don't understand context. They don't understand that adults are stressed, tired, traumatized, or doing their best with limited emotional skills. Children see everything as personal. Every reaction becomes a reflection of their own value. And slowly those reflections become identity. That is the root of the failure loop. Not failure itself, but what failure came to represent in the emotional language of your childhood. For some, failure meant shame. For others, it meant withdrawal of affection. For others, it meant punishment. For others, it simply meant that nothing they did would ever be enough. Every child adapts differently, but the adaptations always follow one of two paths. They either shrink themselves or they overperform. Both are fear-based. Both form loops. Both sabotage adulthood in different ways. Imagine a child who learns that the safest thing to do is to stay quiet, small, unobtrusive. That child becomes an adult who hesitates to take risks, who downplays their talents, who avoids conflict, who overthinks every decision, who stops themselves from pursuing opportunities because a part of them believes visibility is dangerous. Now imagine a child who learns that the only way to receive affection is through achievement. That child becomes an adult who exhausts themselves with overworking, perfectionism, or impossible standards, always feeling like the ground will collapse beneath them if they slow down for even a moment. They achieve, but they never feel worthy. They succeed, but they never feel safe. Different outcome, same wound. A failure loop is not about external failure. It's about the internal meaning your nervous system associates with success, failure, effort, rest, visibility, and vulnerability. And childhood is where those emotional meanings were programmed. The truth is, most people don't sabotage themselves because they're afraid of failure. They sabotage themselves because they're afraid of the emotional consequences their child self was trained to expect from failure. Your body remembers what your mind tries to forget. And because the subconscious doesn't differentiate between past and present, your system tries to protect you from the emotions you once associated with danger. If visibility meant criticism when you were little, your adult self will hesitate to be seen. If ambition triggered negativity at home, your adult self will unconsciously dim your potential. If vulnerability led to rejection, intimacy will terrify you. And if making mistakes led to punishment, you will freeze, procrastinate, avoid, and create complexity where simplicity would suffice. This is the essence of the failure loop. The nervous system repeats what is familiar, even if the familiar is painful. This is why you might notice yourself returning to the same kind of relationships, the same kind of jobs, the same kind of financial patterns, the same emotional cycles. Not because you consciously choose them, but because your subconscious does. And the subconscious chooses whatever feels like home, even if home was chaos, unpredictability, neglect, or conditional affection. People don't repeat the past because they want to. They repeat it because the nervous system is programmed to equate the familiar with safety. And here's the most paradoxical part. If you grew up surrounded by fear, failure, instability, or criticism, success will feel emotionally unfamiliar, which means, to your subconscious, success may feel unsafe. That single truth explains more self-sabotage than any motivational speech ever could. Because until you understand that your childhood trained your nervous system to feel more comfortable with failure than with success, you will keep trying to fix your life with willpower alone. And willpower is useless against subconscious programming. When the inner child is threatened, when old wounds are triggered, when familiar emotional patterns are activated, the adult self loses control. The body takes over, and the loop repeats. People call this procrastination, laziness, inconsistency, or fear of commitment, but these are not personality traits. They are adaptive responses that once kept you safe and now keep you trapped. The hardest thing for most adults to accept is that the version of themselves repeating these patterns is not the adult at all. It's the child inside them, frozen in time, reacting to life with outdated emotional rules. And that child isn't trying to ruin your life. They're trying to protect you from a past that no longer exists. This is the tragedy and the awakening. Your failure loop is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that something happened to you.
The real shift begins when you start to observe your reactions with curiosity instead of judgment. When you notice the hesitation before taking an opportunity and ask, Whose fear is this? When you catch yourself preparing for the worst and realize you're not responding to the present, but to a memory. When you pause long enough to understand that the voice telling you you're not good enough does not belong to you. It was inherited, absorbed, internalized. And once you see this clearly, even for a moment, something inside you begins to rearrange itself. The truth is that your childhood programmed your failure loop, not because you were doomed to fail, but because your system was trying to protect you from emotional harm. Every loop, every blocked opportunity, every moment of self-sabotage was your mind's way of keeping you safe based on outdated information. It was all a strategy, an intelligent, adaptive strategy for a world that no longer exists. But no one tells you this growing up. No one explains that your brain wires itself based on the emotional environment of your earliest years. No one warns you that the wounds you didn't even know you were collecting would become the blueprint for your adult behavior. So you grow up believing these patterns are you. You think the hesitation is part of your personality. You think the fear of success is irrational. You think the procrastination means you're lazy. You think the perfectionism means you're demanding. You think the emotional intensity means you're dramatic. You think the numbness means you don't care. You think the overworking means you're ambitious. You think the underworking means you're incapable. But none of these things are your identity. They are adaptations, brilliant ones, but created by a child with limited tools and limited understanding. When you see it this way, compassion replaces shame, and compassion is the first crack in the loop. Because the loop thrives on the belief that you are the problem. It survives on your confusion. It grows stronger every time you blame yourself for not being able to outrun your programming. But once you understand the origin of the pattern, you stop fighting yourself and start understanding yourself. The moment you do that, the pattern begins to lose its power. The nervous system begins to relax. The protective strategies begin to loosen. And the adult you, the one who wants to grow, expand, and evolve, finally begins to emerge. Still, awareness alone does not dissolve the loop. Awareness is the door, but you still need to walk through it. And walking through it means confronting the emotional truth that you have spent years avoiding. The fact that your childhood shaped your beliefs about what you're allowed to have. This is the part most people resist because it requires you to revisit the emotional atmosphere you were raised in. It requires acknowledging what you needed and didn't receive. It requires admitting that your parents, even if they loved you deeply, may have passed down their own fears, limitations, and wounds. It means recognizing that your internal barriers were built from someone else's unresolved pain. And that is not an easy truth, but it is a liberating one. Because the moment you understand that the voice telling you, don't try, don't hope, don't shine, or don't dream too big, isn't your voice but an inherited echo, the spell breaks. Emotional echoes lose their power when exposed to the light of awareness. Some people grew up in environments where success was resented. Some grew up where ambition was mocked. Some grew up watching their parents fail repeatedly and internalized failure as a family identity. Some grew up in homes where everyone survived on fear, scarcity, and smallness. And so success becomes unfamiliar. Joy becomes suspicious. Abundance becomes uncomfortable. Peace becomes unbearable. Love becomes overwhelming. Confidence becomes foreign. This is why so many adults unconsciously recreate their childhood environments, not because they want to, but because their nervous system wants to return to what it knows. If chaos was normal, calm feels threatening. If affection was rare, unconditional love feels suspicious. If emotional distance was standard, intimacy feels suffocating. If disappointment was common, hope feels dangerous. You can see this everywhere in adult life. People who pull away just when things are going well. People who lose motivation the moment they begin making progress. People who end relationships just when vulnerability is required. People who sabotage habits the moment consistency starts to build results. These are not failures, these are attempts to return to emotional equilibrium. The failure loop is not logical, it is biological, it is emotional, it is the nervous system seeking familiarity. This is why people can consciously crave success while unconsciously fleeing from it. The child inside them is still operating the controls, insisting on repeating the emotional experiences that once defined their world. And until you address the child, the loop continues. Healing the failure loop is not about positive thinking, productivity hacks, or forcing yourself into new behaviors. Those are surface-level tools attempting to solve a root-level wound. You can try as hard as you want, but you cannot override emotional programming with logic. You cannot bully your subconscious into expansion. You cannot shame your way into growth. And you cannot outrun your past by pretending it didn't shape you. The real work begins when you realize that the child who learned to fear failure is still inside you, waiting not for blame, not for punishment, not for pressure, but for safety. Safety is what rewires the mind. Safety is what dissolves the loop. Safety is what allows the adult self to step into its full potential without the inner child panicking. But safety doesn't come from the outside. It comes from finally becoming the adult you needed when you were small. It comes from speaking to yourself gently instead of critically. It comes from noticing your fear without collapsing into it. It comes from allowing mistakes instead of punishing yourself. It comes from giving yourself permission to slow down, rest, recalibrate. It comes from replacing self-abandonment with self-presence. It comes from understanding that progress without safety is unsustainable. And the moment your system feels safe enough to stop living in survival mode, the failure loop begins to unravel. You stop expecting everything to go wrong. You stop sabotaging yourself. You stop abandoning your goals halfway through. You stop shrinking to make others comfortable. You stop believing that success will cost you the people you love. You stop clinging to the patterns that once protected you. Slowly, the world begins to look different, not because the world changed, but because the child inside you finally believes it's safe to grow. And this is the part most people never reach, because they spend their entire lives trying to fix the adult without ever acknowledging the child. They keep pushing forward without noticing the part of them that is terrified of what forward represents. But once you reconnect with that part, once you understand its fears, once you give it a sense of safety, something miraculous happens. You stop living from your old programming. You begin living from your truth.
The truth is, the moment you stop living from the old code, the landscape of your life subtly shifts. You begin to notice opportunities that were always there, but previously invisible. You notice a new willingness to try again, not from desperation or pressure, but from curiosity. You feel a strange lightness, a sense that maybe, just maybe, you're allowed to outgrow the version of yourself your childhood once demanded you become. This is the beginning of reprogramming, and it starts not with radical action, but with a shift in identity. Childhood taught you who you needed to be to survive. Healing teaches you who you truly are. But the transition between those two identities is not instant. It doesn't feel like an epiphany. It feels like confusion at first. The failure loop, no matter how destructive, is familiar, and the mind always gravitates toward familiarity. Breaking away from it often feels like stepping into a void. There is no script to follow, no templates to mimic, no emotional blueprint. For someone who lived most of their life repeating patterns, the unknown feels like a threat. And this is the moment where many people retreat into old habits, not because they want to fail, but because they want to feel safe. Safety has always been the engine behind every loop. This is why when you start making progress, something inside you tenses. You feel exposed. You feel vulnerable. You feel like you're doing something you're not allowed to do.
Because in childhood, trying to grow beyond your environment triggered disapproval, disappointment, or emotional distance. Even if it wasn't spoken outright, children are incredibly good at sensing the signals beneath the surface. A glance, a sigh, a subtle tone, a dismissive comment, a shift in mood, a lack of encouragement, a tightening in the room. Children read energy more fluently than language. So the moment your adult self begins to expand, the child inside you senses the shift and whispers, "Stop, this isn't safe, this didn't end well last time." And suddenly, your motivation drops, your fear spikes, your mind becomes foggy, your plans feel unrealistic, your confidence disappears, your desire fades. Not because the path is wrong, but because old programming has been activated. This is the moment most people misinterpret as self-doubt or lack of discipline. But it is not doubt, it is not laziness, it is not weakness. It is simply the emotional memory of a time when being too visible, too ambitious, or too hopeful cost you something. Maybe it cost you connection. Maybe it cost you acceptance. Maybe it cost you affection. Maybe it cost you freedom. Maybe it cost you approval. To a child, those costs are devastating, so the mind learned to protect you from ever risking them again. This is how the failure loop becomes self-sustaining. The moment you move toward growth, the system triggers emotional alarms, steering you back into the familiar territory of smallness, hesitation, and stagnation. The failure loop is not a loop of action, it is a loop of emotional meaning. To break it, you must create new meaning, not in your mind, but in your nervous system. And this is where the work becomes internal. It begins when you realize that your inner child is not against you. It is trying to protect you from pain it once could not handle. But now, you are no longer that helpless child. Now you can offer the safety you never received. Now you can interrupt the cycle with presence, compassion, patience, and awareness. Reprogramming begins the moment you say, "I understand why you're afraid, but we're safe now." These simple words, spoken internally, create a rupture in the loop. Because for the first time, the part of you that once felt alone, overwhelmed, unprotected, or unseen finally has someone to listen to it, someone to validate it, someone to stay, someone to lead. And once that part of you feels safe, the adult you begins to gain real power. At first, the changes are subtle. You notice you don't immediately freeze when you face a challenge. You don't collapse into panic when you make a mistake. You don't punish yourself for resting. You don't feel that heavy, sinking dread when you begin something new. You catch yourself when the old narrative tries to take over. You pause. You breathe. You choose differently. This is what breaking the loop looks like. Tiny choices, invisible shifts, new emotional associations. But the real transformation happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize something profound. The stories that once controlled you no longer feel like your truth. You look back at the fears that once defined your world and feel a strange distance from them. The hesitation that used to grip your body now feels optional. The shame that used to overwhelm you now feels misplaced. The belief that you weren't meant for more now feels absurd. You begin to see your life with clear eyes, as though a fog has lifted. And then comes the most unexpected part. The world starts responding to your new identity. Not because the world changed, but because your energy did. The opportunities that once felt too big now feel attainable. The conversations you once avoided now feel natural. The relationships you attract begin to reflect your healing instead of your wounds. The projects you once feared begin to feel exciting. You stop sabotaging your momentum. You stop running back to old patterns. You stop shrinking to fit into spaces you've outgrown. You begin to expand, and you expand without guilt. For the first time, success doesn't feel like a threat. it feels like home. But this shift comes with an unexpected revelation. Once you start experiencing life without the failure loop, you realize how much of your potential was locked away by emotional programming you didn't choose. You realize that the version of you that struggled, hesitated, and doubted themselves was never broken. They were burdened with responsibility they were never meant to carry. They were acting out a script written by a version of you who simply wanted to survive. And now you're ready to rewrite that script. This is the beginning of true change, not the surface-level kind, but the deep transformation that alters the trajectory of your life. Because when you heal the inner child, when you dissolve the old programming, when you break the emotional associations that kept you trapped, you don't just create new behavior, you create a new identity, a new emotional reality, a new nervous system blueprint. And this is when life truly begins to shift in extraordinary ways.
And now we arrive at the moment most people never reach. The point where the loop finally becomes visible. Because once you can see the pattern, you're no longer trapped inside it. You're standing on the outside, watching it run like an old machine whose gears you finally understand. And in that moment, something shifts. The story you believed was your life begins to reveal itself as nothing more than a script, a set of instructions written long before you knew how to choose. A script that kept repeating, not because you were weak, but because no one ever showed you how to step outside it. You spent most of your life believing you were the problem, that you were too inconsistent, too afraid, too unmotivated, too slow, too broken. But the truth is more compassionate and far more terrifying. You were simply programmed. You learned failure the same way you learned language, by being immersed in it day after day until it became natural. You didn't choose your coping strategies, you inherited them. You didn't choose your reactions, they were carved into you. And your failure loop wasn't a flaw, it was survival. It was your nervous system doing the best it could with the environment it was raised in. At some point, perhaps without realizing it, you internalized the emotional atmosphere of your childhood. If love was unpredictable, you learned to doubt yourself. If affection was rare, you learned to shrink. If anger filled the air, you learned to anticipate threat. If no one cared about your feelings, you learned not to care about your own. And those lessons didn't stay in childhood. They followed you into adulthood, whispering through every choice you made, pulling you back whenever you tried to move forward. Every time you felt the spark to try something new, the loop responded instantly, a tightening in your chest, a wave of procrastination, a sudden voice saying, "Don't do this, you'll fail like always." You thought those reactions were you, but they were the echo of a younger version of yourself, still trying to keep you safe. Breaking the loop begins with recognizing this: you are not defective, you are programmed, and programming can be rewritten. But rewriting it doesn't happen with force. It doesn't happen with discipline or motivation or pushing yourself until you break. It starts with awareness, noticing the exact moment the loop activates, that tiny microsecond when your body tenses, when your mind tries to run, when your habits pull you backward. Most people never see that moment because they're already inside the spiral. But when you can pause and witness it, something loosens. You create space, and space is where reprogramming begins. In that space, you get to speak to yourself differently. You get to become what no one was for you, the steady voice, the safe presence, the internal parent who says, "I see you, you're not alone. Let's take this one step at a time." The child inside you never needed perfection. It needed reassurance. It needed consistency. It needed a sense of safety that your environment couldn't give. And now, as an adult, you finally get to offer what was missing. You become the one who rewrites the emotional code, slowly,
gently, consistently. And with every moment of awareness, the loop weakens, the fear softens, the triggers lose their sharpness, the automatic reactions pause long enough for you to choose differently. And that, right there, is the beginning of real transformation. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, subtle, quietly powerful. Because once the loop starts breaking, something unexpected happens. Space appears. Space for desires you buried years ago. Space for possibilities you never believed were available to you. Space for the version of yourself that was always waiting beneath the programming. And this is why healing feels confusing at first. You're not just removing an old identity, you're meeting the real one for the first time. It can feel disorienting, almost like standing in front of a blank page after a lifetime of reading someone else's script. But this is where your life finally belongs to you, not to your past, not to your conditioning, not to the emotional climate you were raised in. You're no longer inside the failure loop. You are watching it from the outside, realizing you have the power to step in any direction you choose. And the truth is simple. Your childhood programmed your failure loop, but your awareness rewrites the outcome. The moment you can see the mechanism, you're no longer controlled by it. You're the one holding the pen. You're the one writing the next line. And the old story, the one built from fear, rejection, instability, or pain, no longer has authority. You do. So if this message is reaching you, if you felt something shift, if you felt seen or understood in a way you haven't before, don't disappear back into the old pattern. Stay with the work. Stay with the awareness. Stay with the version of you that is finally waking up. And if you want to keep going deeper, if you want to keep unraveling the programming and rebuilding the life that was meant for you, subscribe. Stay here. This space exists for people like you, people who are done repeating the same cycle and ready to step out of it once and for all. Because breaking the loop isn't about force, it isn't about perfection, it's about awakening, and you are waking up. This is the moment the cycle ends. This is where the new story begins.